It's Bucket! I know it's been a while since the last video, but for good reason. You see, I've been busy. Oh, have I been busy. I've put together visuals, built structures, sacrificed SSDs for 2 months. But finally, I've done it. I've put together the ultimate guide to Applied Energistics 2. Obviously, with this video, I can't just build your systems for you, but I can give you the best tools that a video can give so that you, yes you, can put it together and understand how it all comes together. And I know this seems like a long video, but trust me, I've condensed this information for you as much as possible. You might, no, you will probably have to rewatch some parts because I don't expect you to set up your entire system in one day. So I've included some timestamps in the description. So if you do appreciate this video, don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, share it with your friends. Feel free to let me know what you think in the comments. I read all the comments. So without further ado, let's get into it. The main resources from Applied Energistics that are going to be relevant for you are going to be Certus crystals, silicon, and Fluix crystals. There are a number of ways to get these resources depending on whether you're playing with complementary mods like Advanced AE or if you're playing a mod pack like All the Mods 10. For that reason, make sure to check JEIs as there are usually more convenient ways to gather these resources with other mods. You can do this by hovering over the item and either pressing left click or R. If you're playing All the Mods 10, everything can be gotten through mystical agriculture or productive bees. Otherwise, both silicon and Fluix crystals both come from first having Certus crystals. And getting access to these is one of the first steps to starting Applied Energistics. To start off, you're going to need to find a meteorite. You might stumble upon one as they're pretty hard to miss on any map. Otherwise, you can craft a meteorite compass, which you can get by first crafting a charger, giving it some power, and charging a regular compass. Inside the meteorite, you'll find some budding Certus quartz, as well as a mysterious cube, which if you mine it, will give you a guidebook, as well as these inscriber presses, which I'm going to come back to. You don't actually need the physical guidebook. You can always access it by hovering over any Applied Energistics item and holding G. I'd highly recommend referring to it if you want any specific information or examples, as there's quite a lot of information to take in with this mod. You're going to want these budding Certus quartz to start growing Certus crystals. These blocks will also degrade. They'll degrade if you mine them, but they'll also degrade over time, in which you'll be left with a Certus block, which you can then turn into Certus crystals. What you're really going to want to keep an eye out for is flawless budding Certus quartz. This block won't degrade like the other ones, unless you mine it, so make sure you avoid mining it at all costs. The intended way to move it is you have to progress far enough to build a spatial storage system, allowing you to essentially cut and paste these blocks to move them. But if you're playing All the Mods 10, you get to make a cardboard box from Mechanism using sawdust from productive trees. Very easy and very cheap. Then we just need to set up a way to mine the growing crystals. Of course, Applied Energistics also provides the means to automate this. It also includes growth accelerators, which you can put against these budding blocks to make them grow faster. But there are a number of concepts involved in this setup, so I'm going to use this as an example later on in the video when you've got some more context. Next, in our resource chart from earlier, Certus quartz dust can be made by throwing these crystals into a machine called an inscriber. This dust can then be smelted to give you silicon. Charged Certus quartz is another form of Certus quartz that we'll need, which we can get by throwing our Certus crystals into a charger. Those crystals are made through what's called an in-world transformation. We need charged Certus crystals, redstone, and nether quartz. Throw them in some water and you've got some Fluix crystals. The next resources we're going to need are going to be processors. Because of course a computer mod has got to have computer chips. This is where we're going to be using our inscribers and those inscriber presses that we found earlier. You can start using your inscriber without having to set up anything else. All it needs is power. There are 3 processors: logic, calculation, and engineering. To make them, we're going to need silicon, gold, Certus, diamond, and redstone. The redstone we're going to use later on in this process. With the other materials, they are each going to go in an inscriber with a specific inscriber press to form a printed circuit. This is one half of your processor. In the inscriber here, we have Certus crystal and a calculation press. And together, it's going to make a printed calculation circuit. Then these circuits are going to go into the inscriber again. This time, each of them are going to be combined with the printed silicon that we just made and redstone. And together, they make a processor. Back to our example, our calculation press will combine it with printed silicon and redstone. And together, it's going to make a calculation processor. I'm going to go through how to automate this process later on in the video, but first, we need to understand how our Applied Energistics system works. This is a Fluix cable, and this is your start to your Applied Energistics system, or your ME network. The first thing your system's going to need is power, which is best if it comes from another mod. But to do that, we need some kind of power adapter block, which is the energy acceptor. Your ME controller will also function as an energy acceptor, and also provides channels. Your ME controller is essentially a big switchboard. 32 Ethernet cables can be plugged into any one side. Our Ethernet cables are then organized into neat little bundles, and these bundles are our Fluix cables. In addition to our Fluix cable, a dense Fluix cable is actually able to hold all 32 Ethernet cables. Our normal Fluix cable can hold 8. So our Fluix cable bundles together our Ethernet cables so that we can connect them to all our devices. And so for this example, Ethernet cables are what we call channels. On top of that, a Fluix cable will also transmit power. So if we end up needing more channels, we just need a bigger controller. More controller means more channels. The rules to building your ME controller are as follows. You can only have one ME controller per network. The maximum size your controller can be is a 7x7x7. In the guide, it says that you can have 2 adjacent blocks in at most 1 axis. Basically, this means that building in a line is good, L shape is good, T shape is good, plus sign is no good. If you've broken any of these rules, your controller will turn red. Now that we understand how channels work, it's going to be a lot easier to make sure that we have enough channels for your devices. If you haven't pieced it together yet, here's the TLDR. Our ME controller can provide 32 channels per side. A dense Fluix cable can connect to one of these sides and provide all 32 channels. That means potentially we can have 4 Fluix cables branching off of that dense cable, providing 8 channels each. Of course, you could use more than 4 Fluix cables. Really, you can split up these channels however you like, so long as you have enough channels for your devices. So, how do you check to see if you have enough? So this map I drew is actually a physical representation of your channels, and your cable will tell you the exact same thing. Generally, you want to check your total channels used by checking the start of the cable. That's the part that's closest to your ME controller. On our map, you would be able to count out 8 wires connecting to our controller. On our actual cable, you can see that it's telling us 8 out of 8 channels. As we move along, we've dropped off 2 channels from our bundle here, which leaves us with 6. Similarly, as we pass this intersection, our cable tells us 6 out of 8 channels. The same thing happens as we move along, dropping off another 2 gives us 4, another 2 gives us 2. And similarly, if I move over to one of our devices, if we check the map, we should only see 1 channel here. So the information about channels that you read from your cable is only possible because I've been using Fluix smart cables. There are other cables, the glass cable and the covered cable. These cables will still work the same way as your smart cable, but won't give you any information about your channels. AE2 blocks will also function as cables, meaning that your cables will work as if they're going through those blocks. In other words, even though in our setup on the far side we have blocks cutting up our cable, there's no functional difference between either setup. As here, every block will transmit power and channels as if it's a cable. It's also important that your cables don't cross. Your system will always try and find the shortest route to the devices that need channels. That means that if you're trying to have your cables ranged a certain way, if they cross, you may not be getting your channels where you want them to go. So to manage your cables, you can just make sure that they're spaced apart. In addition, you can use cable anchors, which will go in between your cables and stop them from connecting. Quartz fiber will only allow power to pass through, meaning that we can use them the same way as cable anchors to separate our channels. You can also use different colored cables, as different colored cables won't connect. The only exception being the default colored Fluix cable, which will connect to any cable. To color your cables, you can simply craft them a specific color, or you can use a color applicator. The color applicator works by using dyes, which you can load up using an ME chest. So to do this, make sure your ME chest has power. Then you can insert your color applicator through the front face where the slot is. Then we can access it through the screen on the top side, where you can put any colored dye. You also need to make sure that your color applicator is charged with power. When using the color applicator, cycle through the colors by right-clicking in the air, or by pressing shift and using the scroll wheel. Then just right-click your cable to apply color. Applied Energistics is also a storage mod, and everything is stored digitally on storage cells. There's storage cells for items, but also fluids. If you're playing all the mods 10, you also have storage cells for chemicals, radioactive material, source, and power. Your storage cells will come in different sizes, but can only hold a limited amount of types. For example, an item storage cell can hold 63 types of items. That would be as if it's a chest that can hold 63 stacks of items. The size of the cell affects how big each stack size can be. The bigger the storage cell, the bigger the maximum stack size. If you want to know exact numbers on how much storage cells hold in total, you can refer to the AE2 guide. But roughly, it's about the size of the cell times 4. TLDR is if you have a lot of certain items, for example, if you have some kind of farm, bigger storage cells will help you hold a lot more. If you have a lot of junk and you just want your storage to be able to hold everything and anything, you probably want more storage cells. Once you have your storage cells, you'll need an ME drive. What you got to do then is connect that to your network, put it in your storage cells. Then all we need is a terminal to access our storage. Do note that your terminal will be able to read all storage on your network and not just this ME drive. There's 2 types of terminals. It's a terminal and a crafting terminal. Through the terminal, you'll be able to access all storage on your network. The crafting terminal will do the same thing, but you'll also have access to a crafting table. So I would highly recommend just skipping the terminal altogether and just opting for the crafting terminal. Your ME system can also read external storages like a chest or a barrel by using a storage bus. So as you can see, we have 64 diamonds in this drawer. Now if we look through our terminal, we can see that we have nothing in our system right now. But if I attach this storage bus and connect it to our system, we can see those 64 diamonds in our system. If you want to do anything specific to manage your storage, like set filters or priority system, you do have access to that as well. So to change the priority, you have this button on the top right. A bigger positive number will give a higher insertion priority, and a bigger negative number will give a higher extraction priority. Hovering over these slots on the side, it'll tell you what kind of upgrade cards are available to modify the filter. By default, your filter is a whitelist. By using an inverter card, we can change the whitelist into instead a blacklist. If you want more filter slots, you can use capacity cards. An overflow destruction card functions just like a void overflow card. So when your storage gets full, it'll destroy any excess items coming in. A fuzzy card will ignore durability and NBT data. Remember, Applied Energistics is not just a storage mod, it's also a logistics mod, which means we don't just store items, we make items do things and go places. And to understand how to do that, we gotta talk about things that go on the end of cables. But in all seriousness, these are what we call cable subparts. import and export buses. These are what we're going to use to transport things in and out of our system. They're called import and export buses in reference to our system. Import buses import into our network, export buses export out of our network. They're basically just two ends of a pipe or a hopper. Look, it's even shaped like either end of a pipe. Next, we have the ME interface. It comes in both a cube version as well as a flat face version. Both function exactly the same, only the cube version has more faces to interact with. The interface is more like a chest that acts as an extension of your storage system, like your system's middleman of sorts. By default, anything that gets inputted into it gets sent back to our system. You can also configure it to keep a stock of items. It's not just limited to items, but I'm just using that as an example. The reason why I've referred to it as a chest is because it'll simply just hold those items. It does not actually have the ability to push or pull from other blocks on its own. So if we would include this block into some kind of automation, we'd have to use something else like a pipe to be able to get whatever's in our interface to wherever we need them. So just to summarize, interfaces can transfer to and from our network, but on their own, they can't transfer to blocks outside of our network. Our last cable subpart is our pattern provider, a key block when it comes to automation. So strap yourself in because it's time to learn about autocrafting. Our goal with autocrafting is simple. Make our system do the crafting for us. First, we're going to talk about automating crafting table recipes. First, we're going to need a pattern encoding terminal. This is another screen which we're going to use to record these crafting recipes, which we call patterns. And we're going to record them onto a blank pattern. When making the pattern, we've also got some options. Substitutions and fluid substitutions. Some crafts can be completed with similar items. For example, a lot of crafts that involve wooden planks allow for any kind of wooden planks. The substitution option gives us the ability to decide whether or not we want our system to use any planks, or if we only want it to use a specific kind of plank. That being said, in practice, you want to ideally turn substitutions off wherever possible, because this can sometimes confuse your system, causing some of your crafting operations to get stuck. A good place to use these would be if your recipe involves a tool like an ore hammer, meaning it'll use a hammer with any durability. Otherwise, your system would keep crafting a new hammer every time it wants to perform this recipe, because it thinks it can only do this recipe with a fresh hammer. Fluid substitutions is very similar. For example, a crafting recipe that involves water buckets, the system can just use the fluid water instead, as long as you have water in your system. Once we have our pattern, we can then put it in our pattern provider. Our pattern provider is just the middleman in this crafting operation. It's only going to pass on the message. So we'll have to attach something to it that'll do the actual crafting. And this is going to be our molecular assembler. But just in case I've lost you, here's how everything fits together so far. We're tired of doing our own cooking, so we're going to have someone do it for us. Picture our crafting process like a restaurant. First, we're going to have to provide a recipe so that our restaurant knows what we want and how to make it. Our waiter here is our pattern provider, and we're going to give them the recipe to put on the menu. A waiter, of course, only takes orders. Is going to pass these orders onto our kitchen where the actual cooking is going to take place. And so the actual cooking takes place in our molecular assembler. So just like a restaurant, our system needs something to manage all these things happening. And so to manage our crafting jobs, we're going to need a CPU. The CPU is a multi-block structure, usually made up of two kinds of blocks, crafting co-processing units and crafting storage blocks. I'm going to go back to the restaurant analogy for this. A molecular assembler is a machine that the pattern provider attaches to. But a machine cannot function without an operator, just like a kitchen can't function without a cook. Our co-processing units are essentially chefs that we have available to cook in our kitchen. It's not uncommon for a craft to require a fair few resources. Once our system sends us items from our storage, they're going to need somewhere to go. And so that's what our crafting storage blocks are for. Crafting storage blocks can form a CPU all on their own. Crafting storage block is also the core of our CPU, our manager. Your manager is a hard worker and will count as a staff member able to work at one of the stations in your kitchen. With added co-processors or more staff, they can then assign those staff members to work at any other available crafting stations. So to scale our operations, we just have to put together everything we've learned so far. Firstly, know that you can put acceleration cards in your molecular assemblers. A pattern provider pushes patterns to adjacent blocks. Considering it's a cube with 6 sides, that means we can connect up to 6 molecular assemblers per pattern provider. And to be able to actually use these in a single job, if we had 6 molecular assemblers, we would need a CPU with 5 co-processing units. So that's 5 staff members, and remember the manager also counts as a worker. Just a quick reminder, remember your CPU is a multi-block structure, which means there are some requirements to building it. So the requirements are that you have at least 1 crafting storage block, and that the blocks together form a rectangular prism. Easy workaround is just to build a 1-block tower. Also, you can build a maximum of 17 blocks. Okay, so I'm going to show you exactly what it looks like when you're using different amount of co-processors. I'm going to use this opportunity as well to also show you how to request a craft. We're going to be crafting some chests. So I've gone ahead and made some patterns for each setup, one for the chest, but also one for the planks. This screen over here is a pattern access terminal. This allows us to access all the pattern providers on our network. So I could have also used this to put our patterns in, but what I wanted to show you is by putting each pattern in a different provider, they've appeared on 2 different lines. That's because each line is a separate pattern provider. So in order to spread out our patterns and use all of our molecular assemblers, we want to simply place the patterns in top to bottom. In your crafting terminal, make sure the setting on your left is set so you can view craftable items. Then middle click the item you want to craft. Set your amounts, which, fun fact, you can put a math equation as your amount. I'm going to put in 4 stacks. Then you get a confirmation screen. This is where you'll be stopped if you don't have the required materials or an available CPU. Otherwise, hit the start button to start your craft. So setup on the left has 3 coprocessors and 1 crafting storage, meaning that we should have access to 3 molecular assemblers plus 1 accounting for our storage. On the right, we have 6 coprocessors and 2 crafting storage blocks. This means that we should have access to 6 molecular assemblers plus 1, because our storage as a whole only counts as plus 1. After starting on both crafts, you can see that the one on the left is indeed using 4 molecular assemblers at a time, as I've highlighted for you, and the one on the right is indeed using 7. If you look closely, you'll see them alternating. By now, you should have a good understanding of how your autocrafting setup works. So now we're going to go through some setups to give you an idea of how it might look, and go through the pros and cons of each setup. First, let's talk about pattern providers and molecular assemblers. Main considerations for these setups are channels, crafting efficiency, space, and cost. For efficiency, like I mentioned earlier, you can get most out of your pattern provider by having molecular assemblers on every side. So technically, could I have 32 of these on one dense cable? Yes. Obviously, the main considerations here are space and cost. We're looking at 192 molecular assemblers here, but we're getting full coverage of pattern provider faces. Let's compare that to another setup. So this is a very common setup, which is also in the Applied Energistics guide. 8 pattern providers sharing 8 molecular assemblers, taking up 8 channels from a standard cable. Sharing molecular assemblers also means you don't have to build as many. It's compact, it's simple, and it works. 4 of these, and we can supply channels with 1 dense cable. 32 pattern providers, 32 molecular assemblers. However, I also understand that some of you are gamers, and you like to min-max wherever possible. Perhaps you want this, but you still want to get as much out of your setup as possible. Well, the solution is simple. Molecular assemblers with all 6 sides. Now, it's very unlikely that you'll be in a situation where you're going to be using all of your molecular assemblers at the same time. But just remember that if we do want to use all of them, we would need to roughly match the number of molecular assemblers with the amount of coprocessors in our CPU. However, at some point, you'll also very likely be setting up some crafts to work in the background. This would mean multiple crafts would be happening at the same time. For every job that runs at the same time, you would need another CPU. That being said, your background crafts are exactly that. They run unnoticed in the background, so speed won't be as much of an issue. So for that reason, some smaller CPUs to at least make sure that they can actually run will go a long way. Now, if you understand all that, congratulations. You've unlocked autocrafting. But we're not done yet. Remember, molecular assemblers are our crafting table machine replacements, but there's still plenty of other things that we can automate. We also have patterns available to automate smithing tables as well as stone cutters. Fortunately, these patterns go into the same pattern providers that are connected to our molecular assemblers, which makes things a lot simpler. Onto the juicy one though, processing patterns. These are patterns that give us a lot of freedom when it comes to autocrafting. To our system, we're basically setting up a trade, telling your system that if our system gives up these items, it will receive this item. And then it's up to you to figure out how this happens. Alright, you got the goods? Pleasure doing business. Ha, suckers. Now this actually opens up a lot of options, but things will get a little crazy. For now, what's most applicable to you is these are the patterns that we're going to use to automate machines. Let's say we want to smelt some iron. We're going to have a pattern provider on our furnace, and we're going to tell our system, you give raw iron, you get iron ingot. Yep, it's actually that simple. This is also where I need to bring up that there are a few settings in your pattern provider that will be helpful for regulating certain crafts. So with lock crafting, we can regulate with a redstone signal, and we can also regulate based on where the system has received the finished result. Now, the one that will be more commonly used is blocking mode. If we turn on blocking mode, our pattern provider won't send another craft unless the inventory is empty. This can be helpful for a number of scenarios. For example, if we want to use this one pattern provider to push to multiple machines, because remember it can push from all sides, we can use this to prioritize machines that aren't crafting, which should help spread our workload. There'll also be some machine crafting recipes that will require a very specific selection of ingredients. For those, you'll need to ask yourself, if the pattern provider pushes ingredients, if it then pushes a second batch of ingredients, will that mess up the first craft? If the answer is yes, you need to turn on blocking mode. This is where a lot of people have trouble when it comes to autocrafting. However, I have actually brought up everything that you need to know in order for things to work properly. Just don't forget the fundamentals of Applied Energistics and how their blocks work. Make sure you have enough channels. Make sure your machines are powered. Know which blocks do what, and configure your inputs and outputs to make sure that things are going where they're supposed to be going. In saying that, a lot of the time, it just comes down to knowing which blocks actually push or pull. As promised, I'm going to go through Certus crystal automation and Inscriber automation. Each one I'm going to be showing you how to set it up, and I'll go into detail about why the build is set up the way it is. Just a reminder that if you are playing with other mods, there will likely be better methods available. So here I've got light blue cables to highlight our Certus farm. So we have our flawless budding Certus quartz block. We've got an annihilation plane facing where our crystal is going to grow. We have a growth accelerator touching the block, making sure it's the right way up. In other words, our cables should be going through the top and bottom sides. From our farm, we're going to be putting a storage bus onto an interface, which is going to be coming from our main network. The storage bus, we're going to be adding a filter for Certus crystals. Then we have some cables on top where we're going to be adding a quartz fiber. Then you have the option to add more growth accelerators. Here I've got a total of 4 growth accelerators, and I've also added another annihilation plane at the bottom. When a Certus crystal is fully grown, mining it will give you Certus crystals. If it's not fully grown, you get Certus dust. The annihilation plane works based on whether or not you can store the resulting item. So if we have a storage bus with no filter, it'll break crystals as soon as they start growing because it can store Certus dust. So we have to specify our storage bus filter for Certus crystals. Growth accelerators will accelerate the growth of budding blocks that it's touching, but it can only accept power through its top and bottom sides. So the way we have these blocks placed is very important. Obviously, it won't work without power. The storage bus is using the interface as a chest, which will send the Certus crystals straight to our main storage. Adding the quartz fiber means we can give our farm power for our main network without actually having to connect it to our network. That makes it so our farm would otherwise have nothing to do with our main network, as if it's not connected at all. This is important so we can have an isolated storage for our annihilation planes, and so we can specifically tell it to farm Certus crystals. And by doing this, you've created what's called a subnet. We're going to have one inscriber for every printed circuit and one inscriber to combine everything into processors. But that inscriber we're going to make sure isn't touching the other ones. Inside our inscribers, we're going to turn auto export on and change the input stack size to 1. With the patterns, we're making processing patterns, and we can take it straight from JEI. Make sure to remove the inscriber press from your pattern. Then we're going to have a block shaped pattern provider touching your inscriber presses. Then put in your circuit patterns in your pattern providers and make sure the correct inscriber presses are in those inscribers. Then all of our patterns for processors should go in our last pattern provider, and this inscriber should be empty. If you can afford it, putting acceleration cards in your inscribers will make them go faster. Now we just need to add a Fluix cable to connect your pattern providers and connect this to our system. Keep in mind 5 pattern providers here will need 5 channels. The thing with the inscriber inputs and outputs is the machine itself won't actually tell you, but there is some detailed information in the Applied Energistics guide. This first setting actually ignores those inputs and outputs, as that lets us input and output from any side. Where it says input slots cannot be extracted from, that refers to the 3 slots on the left. So from the guide, that means that normally I can use a pipe on the top side of the inscriber to take out something in this slot. If we toggle the setting, that instead unlocks these slots, meaning that this pipe I put in will suddenly work, because now the inscriber will function based on the inputs and outputs as described in the guide. We want to keep this default setting on. However, that means our inscriber will try and send our output in any direction. So if you have inscribers next to each other, it will try and send it to them. But having an inscriber press in the slot will stop that from happening, as your finished circuits won't be able to go into any other slot. That means the only thing we need to separate is our one inscriber that's doing our processors, because it won't have an inscriber press in this slot. We gotta turn export mode on so that the inscriber pushes the output into our pattern provider. Because remember, pattern providers don't pool. Setting the stack size to 1 is relevant for when we have more inscribers. Let's say if we had 4 inscribers doing calculation circuits. If we requested 4 of these to be made, if each can only take a stack size of 1, this guarantees that our materials will be spread equally. Otherwise, everything could go into one machine, meaning it'll take longer for our circuits to get made. Speaking of expanding, the reason why I arranged them in this towers is because that makes it easier to add more inscribers, like so. Remember, our pattern provider can push to all sides. So this one pattern provider can push to all 4 inscribers that it's touching. Then we just need to add inscriber presses, turn on auto export, and set the stack size to 1. This segment's going to be a bit of a tips and tricks segment, but really it's more of an appreciation over some of the other mods that are available. Specifically, I'm going to be referencing mods that are available in all the mods 10. These things will make your life infinitely easier when using Applied Energistics. Some of these things are going to make you throw those other things I mentioned out the window. Now, of course, I'm only going to be covering key areas, so feel free to explore these mods in your own time as well. You're just exploring the mod, you should know that you can access your ME system wirelessly. All you have to do is craft a wireless crafting terminal. Then you can link it to your system using a wireless access point. Now, if you're on all the mods 10, you also have access to wireless pattern encoders, a wireless pattern access terminal, even an extended pattern access terminal. And all of these can be combined together into one universal terminal, which can go into any Curio slot. To boost the range, you have wireless boosters, an infinity booster for infinite range, or a dimension card for cross-dimensional access. Speaking of wireless, you don't actually need to run cables through your whole base. And you can avoid P2P altogether with the use of wireless connectors. These are blocks that can be connected wirelessly in pairs using a wireless setup kit, and are essentially wireless cables, as whatever cable connects to it on one side is what you have access to on the other. But it's more similar to a dense cable, as it can hold up to 32 channels. Do note that the larger the distance, the more power it'll consume, but you can help reduce this consumption with the use of energy cards. These are great for spreading your network throughout your base, but it does have a range limit. For large distances and cross-dimensional access, we can use a quantum ring. This is a multi-block structure that you have to build 2 of, as you're essentially building some kind of dimensional gateway connecting your network at 2 points. Then you need to craft a quantum entangled singularity, in which you'll get 2 of. Put each of them into the quantum link chamber, which should be at the center of your quantum ring, and they'll be linked. You can then connect cables to any face on the center block of each side.
So actually, the quantum ring is what surrounds the quantum link chamber, and the connection between these 2 structures is what's called the quantum network bridge.
Also, this can only move 32 channels, so it's basically a wireless interdimensional infinite range dense cable. A lot of in-world transformation crafts, whilst you can automate them with Applied Energistics, they're a lot easier to do with a reaction chamber or a crystal assembler. On top of that, you can replace your entire inscriber setup with circuit slicers for circuits and crystal assemblers to put the processors together. The circuit slicers will use blocks and produce multiple circuits at a time, and won't even need an inscriber press. One of the biggest upgrades you'll make to your autocrafting setup, your replacement for your CPUs, as well as your replacement for your pattern provider molecular assembler setup, the quantum computer and the assembler matrix. The quantum computer is your CPU's replacement. This multi-block at most can have almost 9,000 co-processors. By default, this has a 256M crafting storage. Not that you need to upgrade it, but by adding a data entangler block, you could up that to 1,536M. This multi-block is capable of splitting its resources and allocating them to different crafting jobs, meaning that you won't need your additional CPUs. The assembler matrix is the pattern provider molecular assembler replacement. This multi-block isn't limited on the size a pattern provider has. If we compare its ability to molecular assemblers, it's as if any pattern provider could send patterns to all of your molecular assemblers at once. And another great benefit is that both of these multi-block structures only take one channel each. You'll find that a lot of extended AE has a lot of better versions of a lot of Applied Energistics blocks, as well as a lot of variations to things like import and export buses. Some of my favorite variations actually come from advanced AE. A stock export bus will export up to a set limit, essentially keeping items or fluids in stock. The import-export bus is capable of importing and exporting at the same time. What you put on the filter acts as a whitelist for the export part and a blacklist for the import part, meaning that it won't import the same thing that it's exporting. Your ME system can't do recursive crafts, but a quantum crafter can. Not only that, it can craft at ridiculous speeds, making it a very good choice to keep one-step crafts constantly running based on the limits that you set. For crafts that require more than one step, you can use an ME requester. All you have to do is put your item in, set how many you want to keep in stock, and how many you want it to craft at a time. It'll constantly push these crafts to maintain the stock of those items. You can even access all of your ME requesters on an ME requester terminal. Can't find that one device that's missing a channel? Well, you can easily find it using a network analyzer. Simply click something on your network using the tool, and your entire network will be lit up. Any devices with missing channels will be highlighted in red by default. Subnets and P2P. These are topics that deserve separate videos of their own, but they are important topics, so I'm going to give you a brief overview. A subnet is a smaller network, a completely separate network that helps your main network. A common example is the example we showed for the Certus crystal automation, where we have the output of a farm going back to the main system, and the subnet of the Certus farm handles the rest. When we talk about automating farms and machines, we're basically using Applied Energistics as a piping system. Now remember, Applied Energistics functions relative to its network. A pulling end of a pipe will pull something out of a chest and push it to the other end of the pipe. An import bus will pull something out of a chest and into our network. In other words, into our network storage. But if we're making a piping system for a farm, we might as well have those items go to a chest nearby or to another machine. So by setting up a separate network where the chest or machine is the only other inventory, we can have our piping system move things to where we want them to go, instead of everything going all the way back to our main system and all the way back to the farm. So your main system doesn't need to be involved in that piping system at all. And if we don't involve our main system, that means we can save channels. Let's say we have 10 furnaces that we want constantly smelting iron. We could have 10 export buses exporting the raw iron and 10 import buses extracting the iron ingots. This would take up 20 channels. Alternatively, we could have our network export raw iron into a chest and have a storage bus on the chest connected to those export buses. Then we could have another storage bus on another chest connected to the import buses. And then an import bus on that chest for our main network to receive the output. So in this scenario, our main network is instead only using two channels, from the export bus and the import bus. The rest of the channels are taken up by our subnet. It all comes down to how much certain things need to communicate to your entire system as a whole. There's no real limit to subnets. If you need to save channels or isolate inputs and outputs, the sky's the limit. And to simplify this even further, remember, we can still use our main network to power our subnets without connecting them to the main network by using a quartz fiber. Other than that, understanding the piping system of your subnet just comes down to understanding what your cable subparts do, specifically in terms of inputs and outputs. So as a quick reminder, you have subparts that will actively pull, subparts that will actively push, subparts that will pull with help. In other words, they will send items back to our system, but only if something else pushes those items into them. And of course, the storage bus, which will push or pull when requested, but more importantly, marks the storage so the other cable subparts have something to pull from or push to. As remember, everything functions by pulling or pushing from the network storage. In addition, the full block versions of the interface and the pattern provider will also act as cables, meaning that they can provide channels and power. So a few variations of our scenario that will work in a similar way, having a pattern provider instead of an export bus, which will still push to an inventory, an interface instead of the input storage bus, having something pushed directly into the interface will mean that those items will go directly to our machines. Do note that the interface here in the pattern provider can't both be full blocks, because remember, full blocks function as cables and that would connect these two networks. Instead of this setup for our output, we can instead put a storage bus onto the pattern provider to send the output directly back to our system. P2P stands for peer-to-peer. Easiest way to describe what this is are to think of them like portals or the ends of a pipe, as what goes in one end goes out the other. But these are one-way portals. That being said, they can have one input, but as many outputs as you can support, as each P2P does use a channel. P2Ps can be linked using a memory card. Shift-click to copy a frequency of one P2P, right-click to paste the frequency to another P2P. The different P2Ps can be configured into different types of P2Ps by right-clicking with the related items. Be sure to check the AE2 guide for specifics. The most common use for P2P is to move channels. So how does this work? A dense cable can only move 32 channels, but we can work around this with P2P, and here's how. First, we need to set up our P2Ps onto our controller. So each of these P2Ps as inputs can have another P2P to output the 32 channels from this controller face. This is quite literally a dense cable with extra steps and requires 2 channels to run. However, we can bundle up a few of these using a singular cable. 4 pairs of P2P tunnels will take up 8 channels of a normal fluix cable, assuming each tunnel has 1 input and 1 output. I say bundle, and I want you to visualize exactly that. Visualize your cable as a bundle for these 4 P2P tunnels. If you remember way back to when we described cables as a bundle for your channels, this is pretty similar. So we have these P2P inputs where they're being bundled by our cable. Now we can run this cable somewhere else and set up the output faces of these P2P tunnels. Remember, each P2P here is an access point to the ME controller, meaning that each one can provide 32 channels. Similarly, a dense cable with 32 channels can move 16 P2P tunnels. Again, assuming each tunnel has 1 input and 1 output. And much the same, the dense cable just acts to bundle up these tunnels to make them easier to move. Now we don't have to use our main network to provide the channels for these P2P tunnels. It's common to have these channels on a subnet because they don't need to communicate with your network at all. The only thing that needs to be connected is the 2 ends of the P2P tunnels. Keep in mind that any network with more than 8 channels will require its own ME controller. So this subnet will require its own controller to provide those channels. And on top of that, we can add another layer to this. If you remember, wireless connectors are basically wireless dense cables. And similarly, so is the big boy version, the quantum network bridge. So this dense cable that we're using to bundle these P2P tunnels, we can create a wireless connection by using a pair of wireless connectors. So again, just to summarize, here's where your channels are going. We have the channels from 16 controller faces going into the input side of 16 P2P tunnels. These 16 P2P tunnels are then going to get bundled up and moved with a dense cable. This dense cable is then going to go into a wireless connector and out of the paired wireless connector. Then our dense cable can unbundle our P2P tunnels, giving 16 P2P output faces and hence 16 different access points to our ME controller. That's 16 times 32 channels. So did we learn something today? If you did, be sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel. Share it. Let everyone know that this is the guide that they need. This video took an insane amount of time and energy, but I'm still going to be making more modern Minecraft videos, so make sure you stick around if you like what you're seeing. And with that, you're welcome.